Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the final 2022 Construction General Permit webinar. I see that people are streaming in, but at this point, I'd like to hand things over to Greg to get things started.
Thanks, Zach. Welcome, folks. As you're joining up, I wanted to welcome everyone. You're participating in the webinar that's going over the final EPA 2022 Construction General Permit. I'm Greg Shaner. I'm one of the people that worked on the permit, along with a great group of people from EPA. I also want to recognize that we talked to a lot of people outside of EPA during the development of this permit. I want to thank them if you're here today. You may or may not be working on in a state where EPA's permit is in effect. If you are, this presentation will be of direct benefit to you by giving you a sense of what's new in the permit. If you're operating in states outside of the EPA permitting area, I would say it's always good to know what's in the EPA permit. There are some states that pick up the new EPA requirements over time. Some don't, they're not required to, but it's never a bad idea to know what's going on. Just know that if you are in one of those states, you aren't necessarily subject to these same requirements. This permit is brand new, so it's likely that that states will not have picked up on these yet, and it will take some time. Just a few things I wanted to note. We did send out the presentation materials to you in advance. Those are for your reference. Feel free to hang on to those. They have links in them that should work to take you to the different things I'll be referring to on our website, different resources and web pages. So that's for you to have. There are a few changes, very minor, that I made since that was sent out yesterday. I'll try to note those. And then, what we're going to do today is basically go over the highlights of what has changed. We're not going to be covering the front to back of the permit. That would be horrendously boring. There's really no substitute for looking at the actual permit, reviewing it, and there's a number of different ways to do that to pick up what you need, but this is really just a high-level summary of what's changed. A couple things about the webinar. If you have any technical issues with the sound or anything like that, feel free to email Zach. His email is right here. There's also a Q&A box you'll see. We encourage you to submit any questions about the CGP or any of the materials in this presentation. I'm hoping to, and we're hoping to go over as many of those as possible. That's one of the advantages of having a webinar like this. We've muted everyone out just to minimize background noise. And also we're recording the webinar. So after this, if you want to review anything in the next couple of weeks, we should have it up on our website. And if anyone else on your team who's not here today, it'll be archived and available for them to look at. We say this on all of our presentations, but the permit is really controlling. We summarize a lot of the permit provisions in these slides, and just a word of caution not to rely on those summaries. You really just need to find out where the particular section is and make sure you've reviewed the text carefully. Just in case there's a difference between the two, I just want to give you a heads up about that. Abbreviations, most of you are going to have this pretty well down, but the CGP is, when we use that in this presentation, it's the EPA Construction General Permit. A SWIP or SWPPP is a stormwater pollution prevention plan. Many of you are in the business of making those, so you know what they are. But if you don't, these are the documents, the written documents that you create to map out how you're going to comply with the permit. The two documents that you submit for kind of coverage and termination, the NOI or notice of intent is what you submit to get covered, and the notice of termination or NOT is what you submit after construction is complete and you've met all the stabilization requirements to terminate coverage. So you have all the abbreviations. The webinar, just briefly, just to show you what our game plan is here. We are going to talk about the issuance of the permit, just give you the kind of the key dates, give you a brief background so you get a sense of what is kind of the general rules of thumb when it comes to being eligible for coverage under the permit. Then we'll get into the changes in the 2022 permit. There's two types of changes: permit clarifications that we've made. We'll briefly go over those, and then more substantively, where the permit's added specificity, we'll spend a lot of time on those. And then lastly, we'll go over some state and tribal requirements, just to remind you all that if you're using this permit, there are a number of states and tribal areas that have specific additional requirements. And then at two different times in the webinar, we'll stop for questions, not only at the end, but in the middle. And again, we will, when we stop, we'll be looking at the questions that you submit and try to get to as many of those as we can. Okay, to start with, we issued the permit. The new permit was issued on January 18th, which basically means that the regions, the 10 EPA regions signed the permit. And then by regulation, we hold on to the permit for 30 days before it's basically effective. And by that, we mean like new and existing projects can start getting permit under the new permit. And that date was February 17th, so actually a week ago today. Important thing to note, because this can often be confusing, is that if there's an existing construction project that will continue after February 17th, we always in our permits give a period of 90 days at least for those projects to come under the new permit. The 90 days for this permit is May 18th. So if the project will continue past that date, you will need to submit a notice of intent for coverage under the new permit before May 18th or by May 18th. If the project will finish and you can stabilize the construction or the disturbed areas by May 18th, then you'd submit a notice of termination and you wouldn't need to submit an NOI. So hopefully that makes sense, but please feel free to ask questions about that. There are a lot of materials for this new permit on our website. This is what I think are kind of the ones you'll use mostly. These are 5 of basically 9 web pages. But so this first one is where you'll find the permit documents and frequently asked questions. There's a resources one that's quite good. It has a lot of the templates that we've developed for like the SWIP and inspection reports. There's a discharge mapping tool on it. There's the NOI webpage where you'll use to kind of launch into our electronic system. And then 2 areas where we're new areas of emphasis: inspector training. There's a whole dedicated webpage for that. And then also turbidity benchmark monitoring. And I'm going to be talking about those last 2 in more detail in a bit. But this is in the materials we sent out, so you can link right to the web pages. This is a screenshot of what the web page looked like. Nothing fancy here. And all of these links in the permitting topics box are CGP specific, and we'll take you right to the areas that that you'll be interested in. One set of documents we have up, we have obviously the permit, but we also have a red line version of the permit. So for those of you who are needing to know what changes happen kind of on a line by line basis, you'll just go to the red line version and be able to see what we changed from the last permit. Another thing is that we have kind of an online filing cabinet. This is all of our CGPs dating back to '92, and all the related documents, the permit, the fact sheet, the Federal Register notice. So that might be useful for you to have if you need to look back and see how things have changed over the years. We have a document that we actually just posted yesterday. It's basically a frequently asked questions document. This is all the questions from previous CGPs as well as a bunch of new ones. We are going to try to keep this up to date, but these are written out answers to common questions. We've improved the format from previous years. All of these bulleted questions are linked, so you can jump right to the answer. So for instance, if you're interested in like who is an operator and who needs permit coverage, you can hit this link here and then jump to our answer for that. All of these answers are somewhere in our materials in the fact sheet or on the web, but this is kind of a nice document, which if you have a specific question, just feel free to check that out. You can always get in touch with us, but this is just something we have out there. Hopefully it's of use to you. Okay, moving into the background of the CGP. Of course, you all know that there's regulations that put this all into place. I didn't want to go into the whole history here, but a lot of what it comes down to with the EPA permit is, can you use the EPA CGP? We get a lot of questions from people in different states. Can I use this permit? Basically boils down to 3+ main questions. Is this a regulated construction activity? And do you have a discharge from it? Is your project located in an area where EPA is the permitting authority? And is the individual asking an operator? So if you answer yes to all these questions, then you can use the EPA permit. And as an operator, you would submit an NOI and get coverage. To go over each of these like really quickly, is this a regulated construction activity? Construction activity is basically earth disturbing activities. We've defined it in our regs as clearing, grading, and excavating land and other construction related activities. Over the years, we've also clarified that things like stockpiling of materials on an acre or more, well, I'll talk about the acre in a second, that could also be construction. We've also clarified that things like maintaining existing highway grades are not construction, as long as you're not kind of going below those and disturbing new earth, basically. But that's what it comes down to. And essentially, the threshold here is construction activity disturbing 1 or more acres of land? Or is it disturbing less than an acre in pieces, but over time, as part of a common plan of development or sale, will be more than an acre, or an acre or more? Here's what an acre looks like. It's basically 90 yards of a typical football field. And so you could imagine, for the common plan issue, if you're dividing that up into 3 and doing individual phases of a construction project, over time, if those are all less than an acre, each of the phases, but since the whole thing is going to disturb at least an acre, then you'd need permit coverage for each phase. The second issue is EPA, the permitting authority, comes down to basically, are we one of the 3 states, or are you in one of the 3 states, or DC or other territories or tribal lands or federal facilities where EPA is the permitting authority? And we list those in the permit, pretty clear about that. And if you're not in one of those areas, then you'd be basically contacting your state to see what permit options are available. The last issue is, are you an operator? This is probably the thing that we are asked to clarify most often, but an operator is who actually holds the permit. They're legally, they're liable for compliance. They submit the NOI, they sign reports. The operator in the EPA permit is either a person who has operational control over the plans and specs, or the ability to modify them, or someone who has day-to-day operational control over the project itself and compliance with the permit. It's often 2 different people or 2 different entities, and both under the EPA permit are required to be permitted. So you may have on the same project 2 or more permittees. And it really comes down to operational control. Those areas that we've listed above are kind of the big picture. But we've also listed out some different examples in our Q&A and in the fact sheet of what some of those tend to be. These are examples of where operational control is sufficient to be an operator under our permit. So authorizing construction activities, procuring project plans and specs, approving, disapproving plans and specs, or bids, approving, disapproving SWIPs and SWIP modifications, issuing cease and desist orders, and carrying out the construction activity. These are all areas that would fit one of the 2 definitional criteria for operator. This flow chart we've created, we've had on our website for a number of years, complicated seeming as it may be, takes you through all the things I just talked about. So you can find that flow chart. This basically answers you, it gives you guidance on whether an EPA or state permit would be appropriate or required for your project. Lastly, in terms of background, we're going to be talking about a number of changes from the last permit, but basically we've maintained the core structure of the CGP over time. We haven't modified that. It comes down to 4 basic things. You're preparing for coverage, you're getting coverage, you're implementing or taking action to comply, and you're stabilizing the site. Under prepare, you're determining whether you're eligible for the EPA permit. You're developing a SWIP, the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, which you have to do before submitting an NOI. Then you're submitting an NOI. You're waiting the 14-day waiting period, which we've had in place. And then you're getting coverage. Once you get coverage, you're doing the things to comply. You're installing stormwater controls. You're conducting inspections and taking corrective actions as necessary, and maintaining your controls. And then you're completing the necessary paperwork, documentation that's required by the permit. Once you're all done with construction, you stabilize the site, and there's a 14-day requirement in the permit, depending on the disturbance size. And once that's done, you can submit your notice of termination to terminate permit coverage. That basic structure hasn't changed. Again, just a reminder that the state permits are a little different. They tend to follow the same structure, But just know that if you're in one of those states, you're going to need to pay attention to that specific permit. Okay, finally, let's get into the new permit. High level terms of changes, there's two different buckets of changes, two categories of types of changes we've made. We've made a number of clarifications from the previous permit based on request or confusion to try to clarify our intent. I'll highlight some of these. And then we've added permit specificity in specific areas where there was the need for kind of more specific requirements or an area of concern for EPA. And I'll be going over all of these in a little bit, but especially construction dewatering, and inspector training are a big area of emphasis under this permit. There's also a extensive list of where all the changes that we made, and it's in the fact sheet. This table has all of the changes pretty much line by line and where to find them. So between that and the red line version of the permit, you should have what you need to know what we changed. So talking about the permit clarifications, and we're going to stop after this section, see if there's any questions. To start with, we made some clarification in terms of the selection and design of controls. First off, there was some concern in the last permit that vendors have been advertising their products as EPA endorsed or EPA supported. And based on that, we clarify in several places in terms of controls, in terms of SWIPs, we don't recommend or endorse specific vendors or products. So we have specific language about that. Pretty straightforward. New design considerations. A few of these are kind of climate related to make sure that you're using the most recent data available when you're accounting for precipitation, frequency, intensity, duration. Make sure you're using more recent data so that you can account for swings in the precipitation patterns. Also account for whether the site has previously experienced major storms, such as hurricanes, storm surges, flood events, things like that. We don't want people under designing for the types of storms that could take place at your site. And basically, if that's the case, if you have had major storms, consider implementing structural improvements to your controls, enhanced controls, or other mitigation measures to minimize impacts from those events. We also encourage people to infiltrate stormwater on the site, but there will be places, specific sites where this is inadvisable. And we're flagging this as just kind of a consideration for people if there's specific contaminant concerns or the underlying soil or rock strata is just not appropriate for infiltration, because it's not going to infiltrate as we think of infiltration. You can think of things like proximity to drinking water aquifers or highly conductive geological structures like karst or hazardous waste site. Things where you're not just filtering, you might be filtering other types of pollutants that might not work well, or you're maybe contaminating, potentially polluting a drinking water resource. So we flag that. And there's also some links to kind of search for some of these things online to know if you're in close proximity to one of those. We've also indicated that when it comes to inlet controls, we have an inlet protection requirement in the permit but you're relieved of that requirement if you're conveying stormwater, if that inlet is connected to a sediment basin or something similar to that, some kind of detention or retention basin, you would not need to have inlet protection. So that's a new clarification. We've also included a recommendation to consider using wildlife-friendly erosion control products. More specifically, if you're using netting to do vegetative stabilization, there's been some recommendations out there from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's a link in the permit to a really good set of recommendations on the types of products that are considered quote unquote wildlife friendly. So for instance, using natural fiber, loose weave, and non-welded movable jointed netting products are good. Basically, looking to minimize the opportunities for bird species or reptiles to get caught, which is actually something that happens quite a bit. And we're just urging people to consider checking those out and potentially implementing them. Another area of clarification in the new permit is to differentiate between what's routine maintenance on a site and corrective action. We thought we had clarified that in the past, but as it turns out, there was a lot of confusion about what's the difference. So basically what it comes down to is starting off with the inspection requirements in the permit. This is where you as the operator would need to, at various frequencies, inspect the site. This is where you're going to be finding conditions on your site where you're going to need to do maintenance or corrective action. When it comes to routine maintenance, what we say in the permit is that's going to boil down to minor repairs or upkeep. These are not going to be major like replacement of controls or significant alterations to BMPs, but minor repairs. And generally speaking, those can be completed. Those fixes can be completed by the end of the next business day, sorry. And there's some flexibility there if there's a good reason to go a few more days. I think we allow an extension up to 7 and still be routine maintenance. We also have a trigger in there if you find that there's maintenance needed for the same control repeatedly and 3 or more times, that could potentially be considered corrective action. But I won't be going into a lot of detail with that. A corrective action, by comparison, is a significant repair, or where you're going to replace a BMP, and you're going to have to, there's going to be some time component to that where you're ordering the replacement, you have to have it delivered and installed. And there's specific triggering conditions for corrective actions too, such as exceeding water quality standards or observing sediment plumes, things like that. We've also clarified some things related to permit documentation. SWIPs, inspection reports, corrective action logs can all be kept electronically. We've allowed that in the previous permit. We just weren't very upfront about it. So we've included text to make sure people are aware that as long as it's accessible in the same way as a paper record, electronic records are fine. We've changed the corrective action report so that it's less of a report, more of a kind of checklist log format. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And we've updated a bunch of the templates that you can use. These are optional templates that you can use to fill out inspection reports or dewatering reports, the corrective action log again, and even the SWIP. So those are all available on the link here in the website. I mentioned that the templates, these are all available online. They're all Word documents, so you can manipulate those to your specific project, but they're basically fields you can enter in and then just use repeatedly throughout the permit. looking specifically at the corrective action log template, it's a 2-page, pretty simple form. The first page, you're just basically filling out for each corrective action. You're going to put some identifying information, but basically you're looking to just check off what kind of corrective action it is, give some minor details about where it's located, and a description of the condition. Also to check off and confirm that you complied with any deadlines that are in the permit. And it's pretty easy to just identify which one applies to you. And then lastly, you're going to, on the last page, you're going to be describing any modifications you made and when you completed it, if you updated the SWIP, and then signing the log. So you'd have one for each of these, but it's pretty easy to fill out, and you can find that online. Another area where we've clarified relates to inspections in arid and semi-arid areas. We have different requirements, different frequency requirements for inspections. If you're in one of these areas, to kind of recognize the differences in precipitation patterns in those areas. If you're operating in arid, semi-arid, or semi-arid area, and it's the seasonally dry period, your inspection would be reduced to once per month, and then within 24 hours of a 1/4-inch rain event. We have not, in the past, defined what we meant by seasonally dry period. In this permit, we've included a definition, and that is a month in which the long-term average total precipitation is less than or equal to 1/2 inch. And there's a lot of information online to search for those areas, but we've also come up with an Excel spreadsheet tool that you can plug in your zip code and figure out if you're in an arid or semi-arid area, and if any of the months out of the year are considered quote unquote seasonally dry. What that looks like is you're going to be plugging in specific zip codes. This one is the Albuquerque area, this 87101. And you can see here, we've found out here that the project is located in an arid area, not surprisingly. And then January, February, May, and November are considered seasonally dry periods. So during those months, that a project in that area could use the less frequent inspection frequencies. By comparison, this is a zip code in the Boston area, and not surprisingly, it's not in an arid or semi-arid area, and there's no months that are considered seasonally dry. Pretty easy to use. You can rely on this if you're under the CGP, or you can use your own information, but we've developed this for your use for our permit. And I will stop there and see, Zach, if there's any questions on the first part of the presentation.
Hi, yes. We have a few questions, but the first question that I'd like to start with is, for ongoing projects with active 2017 CGP coverage, do we need to file a notice of termination for 2017 CGP once the 2022 CGP coverage is active?
The answer is no. You do not have to submit an NOT for a existing project that's going to be covered under the new permit because you've submitted a new NOI. It just would transfer over. And after May, the reason is that after May 18th, we're basically like, those won't even be on our records anymore. Those will be kind of automatically terminated anyway. So.
Got it, thank you. The next question I have is, if a project SWIP and NOI was developed for the 2017 permit, is a new SWIP book required to accompany the new 2022 NOI?
Yes, you would. I mean, a lot of the SWIP requirements are exactly the same. There are some differences. So you'll want to, what I would do is open up the red line version of the permit in the SWIP section, which is part 7, and go through and find out the changes. It's pretty limited. Some changes in dewatering, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but you do have to have an updated SWIP, and hopefully that the 90 days between like last week and May 18th, that's enough time for you to update your existing SWIP. Did that answer the question? Oh, I hope it did. I can't talk to you anyway. So.
I wish I could tell, but thank you. Next question is, do we need to file NOTs? Can we just let it expire?
The permit requires that you submit a notice of termination. We would urge you to submit an NOT. It's better for you to just be off the records. You're not on our, if you've met the termination requirements, which is basically that the construction has finished, you're done with construction and you've complied with the final stabilization requirements, submit the NOT. It doesn't take long. It's a very simple checklist. And then you've kind of covered yourself in terms of not being on our books. If you're on our books, potentially we could come out to visit for compliance purposes, but if you've met the termination requirements, there's no reason not to do it.
Thank you. Next question is, if permit coverage on an existing project needs to be extended under the new 2022 CGP, does this mean a new NOI and 14-day waiting period is required? Does the existing permit number change once coverage is obtained under the 2022 CGP?
So yeah, new NOI. There's most of the questions are the same. There's a few new questions, but they're pretty simple. There is a 14-day waiting period for you regardless, but essentially until that 14-day expires, we view your coverage is considered extended under the old permit until the new coverage comes online. So there shouldn't be a gap in coverage.
Thank you. Next question, there's a few questions, but next question is, if covered under the 2017 NPDES CGP, your project will continue past May 18th, 2023, and you have not yet submitted for coverage under the 2022 CGP, you would implement 2022 CGP requirements once NOI has been submitted and coverage/authorization is granted?
So here's what I'd say to that. If don't wait beyond May 18th. There's really no guarantee. You'd be considered unpermitted if you wait beyond that point. Hopefully the 90 days gives you time enough to submit the new NOI. I would go ahead and submit it now, or when you're ready to, when your SWIP's updated, because you don't want there to be any question about there being a gap in coverage. We wouldn't necessarily, if a project had failed to submit an NOI before May 18th, we wouldn't necessarily give you credit for complying with the new requirements. And really, we're pretty clear in the permit about needing to submit an NOI. So I'll kind of leave it at that. But if you have any other questions related to that, whoever's asking, let me know.
Thank you. Next question is, with regards to submitting a new NOI for an existing covered project, does the new NOI have to be completely new project, or are you able to renew the existing NOI?
You can renew the existing NOI. You can renew for an existing project. It doesn't need to be new. in fact, that we have the whole category of existing project is intended to enable ongoing projects that were already covered under the previous permit to continue because their construction timeline keeps going to get coverage. So it doesn't need to be a new project. We have a completely different category for new projects.
Thank you. The next question is, if an owner/operator submits an NOI and receives coverage, then delegates authority to a general contractor, would the general contractor need to submit a separate NOI?
So under the EPA, this is different in states. And some states have different approaches, but under the EPA permit, a general contractor is often considered an operator based on the type of operational control, as I mentioned before, they have over the day-to-day activities, which is different than the type of operational control that an owner might have. They have the type of operational control that's like related to the project plans and specifications. And if those are two different entities, it's, you know, our permit would say both need to submit an NOI for coverage. It really just depends on the specific case, but it's common that a general contractor and an owner would need coverage. But again, I say the states sometimes go in a different direction. They may only permit the owner, and I've seen a lot of different variations on multiple permittees being needed. So this is just, I'm just speaking about the EPA permit.
Thank you. The next question we have is, if a site discharges to an existing drainage system in an urban setting, does the action area stop at the point of connection, or does it extend down to the first water of the US? If it extends to the first water of the US and is piped underground, will the action area be disconnected at the site and at the outfall?
I'm not really following the facts here.
I can try to reread it.
I wish I could talk to the person asking it, because I didn't follow the part about disconnecting. And it kind of depends on the context of, there's, you know, if there's so many different scenarios out there, there's, you know, this is not uncommon that in a commercial setting or in a residential construction setting, there's going to be, you know, different, you know, projects that make up the master project. And where is the discharge? Is the discharge from the specific lot, or is it when it leaves the bigger site? Is the discharge when it actually hits a water of the US? I mean, basically, like I'll say in general that a discharge occurs when it leaves the project site. And that's usually, it's common that you'll have like a sediment basin or something like that treating stormwater discharges from all of the different projects that make up the big project. And that the discharge from that sediment basin would be kind of the discharge, the ultimate discharge we're talking about. But I don't understand the disconnection part. And I'm happy to engage with whoever was submitting that separately. So feel free to get in touch.
Thank you. The next question I have is, does the quote action area quote extend to the receiving water?
Action area is a term that describes the endangered species related protections in the permit. So I'm not sure if they're asking about endangered species or about kind of in general kind of permit responsibilities on the site. In general, if it's related to the permit and talking about like what the what the permittee is responsible for, and the discharge, the actual waters of the U.S. is pretty far downstream. It goes through a series of drainage systems before it reaches a recognized waters of the U.S. The area of where the permit takes effect is pretty limited to the actual construction project site, and just maybe a little bit off site to what's visible from the site into the drainage system. But the permittee would not be responsible for going downstream and doing things in the drainage system or in the waters of the U.S. to comply. And the permit clarifies that. So I'm so sorry to be general. I just don't know what the quote unquote action area is.
Thank you. So the next question, I think we have time for about 2 more, is will EPA prompt the delegated states? Sorry, I just lost that one. Let me start over. Will EPA prompt the delegated states to review their own CGPs to meet the minimum requirements of EPA's 2022 CGP?
No. We give the states quite a bit of discretion to establish requirements that they find suitable for their there's basically, what I didn't go over today, there is a background set of effluent guidelines that apply to the construction and development industry. Those came out in 2009. They're basically narrative. Every permit has to address these requirements. They relate to pollution prevention and erosion and sediment control and stabilization. All permits have to have those. They have to address those features. How the states do it varies quite a bit. We don't hold our permit out as kind of a minimum set of requirements, because it's really the regulations that are the bottom line. And it's just that what I was mentioning before about the states is that some states tend to pick up some of the EPA provisions, and likewise, if we've found there to be a problem among our permitted projects, and a state has a good way of dealing with it, we might borrow some of those as well. But we do not hold our permit out as kind of a minimum thing for states to meet.
Noted, thank you. And then the last question we have for this period of time is, it's a question about the E-NOI system. And the person is asking, I have a couple of draft NOIs which required a significant amount of input awaiting certification. Because of the transition, they have disappeared from the system without warning. Can this info be recovered?
Yeah, I'm wondering what happened there, because the NOI should have been given continued coverage. I think what you're saying is that the information that had been inputted is not visible anymore. And I don't implement the electronic system, so I would say there is a get in touch with the net folks. I forget what it stands for. Geez, that's embarrassing. But the NET people, which is basically the E-NOI system, there's a contact there, and they'll get right back to you. I think that's a good question. And I'll also ask, but I would encourage you, since time is of the essence for you, I'd get in touch with them.
Thank you. And I believe that that's all that we have the time to answer at this moment.
All right, thanks for the questions, folks. Those were excellent questions. A lot on the NOI system, which makes sense. This is a transition to a new permit, and we shouldn't give that short shrift. So feel free to keep the questions coming, like outside of this webinar, if we can be of help. We were talking before about the kind of the first bucket of changes that we made to the CGP. There's also another bucket. These are more substantive changes that we made, and we kind of coined this as added specificity. The first is in the area of perimeter controls. Here we were focusing on common problems that you all are probably more familiar with, but problems in terms of installation and maintenance. In terms of installation, we've clarified that the controls need to be installed on the perimeter areas of the site that are downslope from the exposed soil. We don't need perimeter controls where they're going to serve no benefit. We've always had this kind of requirement, but we've had to kind of toy around with the language to make sure that it's saying what we mean it to say. To prevent stormwater from flowing around the ends of the control, there's a couple new language edits we've included. The requirement to install the control in the contour of the slope, basically on points of equal elevation, so you're not getting stormwater going around the edge of the perimeter control, whatever you're using. And then separately, to extend both ends of the control upslope to form like a crescent. So you'll see in this figure, there's kind of a curve upslope to form a crescent. That's just to ensure that the stormwater is not doing an end run around the control. In terms of maintenance, to make sure that it continues to work properly, we've had this requirement before, but we've retained that you remove sediment when it's accumulated to 1/2 of the above ground height. You can see in this picture that that's been exceeded, so they need to dig that out and kind of make sure that silt fence is able to capture sediment from. There's a lot of stuff going on with this site, but that you can clearly see the sediment almost overtopping the control. Also, after a storm event, if you've seen signs that the stormwater has flowed around or undercut the control, make sure that you extend the control as necessary or repair it so that it's functioning. In a different area of the permit related to pollution prevention, we have had requirements related to use and storage of chemical containers. It was suggested to us that it would be far better to reframe our requirements around different size containers, because if you have relatively small containers, you may need different controls than if you have larger containers. And we tried to borrow from the oil prevention regulations to do this, but basically in the new permit, if you have a chemical container of any size, you have certain minimum requirements, such as a container needs to be watertight, kept closed, sealed, and secured when it's not in use. Have a spill kit available. And in terms of spills, clean them up using dry cleanup methods. Don't hose the area down as a cleanup method, and eliminate the spill source to prevent future discharge. If the container is less than 55 gallons, and a lot of containers are 55 or over, But if it's less than, in addition, you could use we require use of a spill containment pallet to capture small leaks. That way you can move the container around the site if necessary. But if it's larger containers of 55 or more gallons, the additional requirements would be that you would need to store it at least 50 feet away from receiving waters or other drainage features. And if that's infeasible, just as far away as possible as the site can accommodate. Also, you need to either have cover or secondary containment for those. So that's new. The next several slides, I'm going to be talking about dewatering. This is extracting water from the groundwater underlying your construction activities or ponded water. We've had a lot of compliance issues with dewatering, and the decision was made to strengthen some of these controls. What we've heard from a lot of our inspectors is that you can get, in a few hours of poorly managed dewatering discharges, more sediment discharge on a few days than over the course of the entire project from stormwater. Because the discharge is controlled by the operator, there's a great deal of operational control that you can have over the quality of water. So our view is, let's make sure we get this right, because the water quality problems could be significant if not. We've made some clarifications in terms of the control requirements. Basically, that the design objective related to sediment is that you're designing controls or installing controls that prevent discharges with quote unquote prevent visual turbidity. Meaning we're looking to avoid things like sediment plumes, or where the discharge looks cloudy or opaque or has a visible contrast of some kind. That's going to be a clue that something's not working. That's not to say that this is a zero discharge standard. We're careful to point out that this is a design component, a design objective rather. You may very well have an issue with your control and there's a sediment plume, in which case it wouldn't necessarily be a violation. It just would mean that you need to check things out with your controls and see if there's something you can improve. Also, the discharge must not cause the formation of a visible sheen or hydrocarbon deposits on the bottom or shoreline of the water body. This is something, again, there's requirements for oil water separators. Make sure those are working. If you see something like this, this is a trigger for you to do some exploratory work. Also, in terms of the sediment controls to prevent erosion, make sure you're putting them on stable areas and don't place them on steep slopes. That we just don't want further mobilization of sediment just based on where you're putting the control. We've also changed the inspection protocols for dewatering. These are going to be done at different frequencies. If on any day you're discharging dewatering water, you need to do an inspection. That inspection is basically looking for certain things. You're going to document the times the discharge began and ended. You're going to estimate the rate of discharge. We give a pretty simple way of estimating that or calculating that. Look for signs, obvious signs of pollutant discharge. Again, sediment plumes, unusual color, odor, decreased clarity, those kinds of things, foam. And also in your records that you have photographs of the dewatering water prior to and following treatment, the controls, and the point of discharge. These pictures are all of an inspection that was done on some sites where there was obviously these are all dewatering discharges. There was obviously some major issues going on with the site. So we want to avoid this. One of the bigger changes we made for dewatering is to add some protections for sensitive waters. And namely, if you're discharging dewatering water to a water that's listed as impaired for sediment, or it's a high quality water, in other words, it's rated as a tier 2, 2.5, or 3 for anti-DEG purposes, there's a new requirement to conduct monitoring, and I'll talk about that in detail. There's a list, by the way, of waters that are tier 2, 2.5, and tier 3 waters on our website. So for our permit areas, you should check if you're on one of those. If you're discharging to a sensitive water, you're going to be required to take at least one turbidity sample from the discharge point on any day of discharge, at least one. You can take more if you'd like, but at least one. By the way, if you're on a project site where there's multiple operators, the permit accommodates your ability to coordinate and have one person do the monitoring. So you can collaborate in that way if you choose to. In terms of the measurement, you're basically taking a grab sample and using a turbidity meter that complies with one of the EPA approved methods. They almost all do, according to my informal search online. They almost all specify which one they apply to. They comply with, sorry. These are usually handheld meters that are very easy to use in the field. You're going to get a result instantaneously. But what are you looking for? We're looking to see if the turbidity is over a benchmark. We've established 50 NTUs as the default benchmark based on our research. We've also given the ability for people to request alternative benchmarks if their turbidity standards support a higher number. So there's a specific procedure to follow to do that. I want to stress, though, that the benchmark is not a limit. Exceeding 50 or whatever your alternate benchmark is not a violation. There's requirements to do some additional corrective action work, but exceeding 50 is not a violation. And we're pretty clear about that in the permit. So if the discharge exceeds the benchmark, let's say it's 50, and basically what you're looking for is the weekly averages. So you break down the, you're monitoring for whenever you're discharging dewatering water and you're averaging the week's worth of samples. If that average is over 50 or whatever your alternate is, then that triggers the need for corrective action. First, you may need to shut off the dewatering discharge if that's the case as soon as possible, and if it's safe to do so. We also have a note in the permit: if any one sample is 355 NTUs or higher, you'd want to shut off the dewatering discharge. And that's basically because if you get a 355 or higher, there's no lower samples that are going to bring it below 50. After you've shut off the discharge, determine if there's ineffective controls that are maybe leading to the exceedance, and make any changes necessary to lower turbidity. Some of this work can be done kind of like right on the spot. Maybe it's obvious that there's some controls that need maintenance or need to be replaced. Hopefully it's a fairly quick assessment. The data that you collect will be reported to EPA. We require that the weekly averages be submitted, not each individual sample, but the weekly averages. And the requirement is to submit them within 30 days of each monitoring quarter. And we have specific monitoring quarters in the permit outlined. The operator submits the turbidity data electronically unless they've been approved to use paper. But the electronic system is set up to for you all to submit data that way. If there are no monitoring weeks in which there's a dewatering discharge, or there's a monitoring quarter with no dewatering discharge, then you just indicate that there's a checkbox and then you're done. And similarly, if you've made arrangements with other operators to collect the data and report it, you can indicate that as well and not have to duplicate their work. The regulations also require that when you're doing sampling, you keep some information on site, in addition to the sample result. The sample location, the turbidity meter, make and model, the test method that it is meeting, the name of the person collecting and analyzing the sample, and the date and time of the sample and analysis. We've created a optional data table that you can use to allow you to kind of pretty easily fill that out. You can find that in our inspection and monitoring guide that's available at this website here. This is a really good guide, by the way, that goes into a lot of detail about where to sample, how to sample, some corrective action suggestions. Really good resource. So I encourage you to check that one out. Okay, moving in away from dewatering now, we also have updated our inspector training requirements. Like in the past, we require that if you are conducting inspections for a permittee, that you be a qualified person. That has been defined in the past permits as someone who basically is knowledgeable. They know the requirements of the permit, and they know the basic principles of erosion and sediment control and pollution prevention, enough that they can spot problems. We've noticed that there are lots of issues with compliance with the inspection requirements. We have decided that one of the ways we'd like to address this is to make sure that people are truly qualified. To do that, to be considered qualified for this permit, at least for the next year, we're keeping the requirements the same. So until February 17th of next year, basically qualified means just basically know the permit and know about the basics of the controls. But starting on February 17th, 2023, if you have a project that starts on or after that date, you either have to have completed the EPA inspector training course, which will be available this summer, and pass the exam, or hold a current certificate from a non-EPA program that addresses certain basic things, basically the erosion and sediment control, pollution prevention basics, proper installation and maintenance of controls, and how to do inspections and document your findings. So to start with, the EPA training will be available either late July or August, certainly August. I think in the presentation I sent to you, it said July, August, but based on I just wanted to be honest, it does look like August it will be available, and then you can start using it. It's an 8-hour training and an exam. It's free for anyone who wants to use it. and we'll be putting out a Spanish language translation sometime after the English version comes out this summer. The training is broken into 5 different modules, and basically the goal is to give the trainee a very good overview of the CGP, basic erosion and sediment control requirements, and common types of controls, and that similar to and also with pollution prevention, and then how to conduct a proper stormwater inspection. One of the neatest parts about the EPA training is we have a guided interactive component of it. We basically went out and looked at 2 construction sites and have kind of 360-degree kind of capability here. So there's a clip I want to show you, but basically it teaches trainees how to conduct a thorough inspection, and users will be able to kind of pan around and click on icons for more information, and then and move on to the next area after that. So this is a clip showing what part of that looks like.
We are now standing on top of the construction entrance. This construction entrance is at the junction of several areas, including the active construction area, material storage areas, and the paved road. Take a moment to look around and get your bearings. Things may look different on site than how they appear on a map. Please work through all the icons to explore the area and evaluate the condition of the construction entrance. Then click the location icon to move on to the active construction area. This is where we are on the site map. We have walked just outside of the active construction area. There is an excavator working on top of the stockpile, but we can carefully walk around to assess the perimeter controls behind the stockpile. Before we do, let's spend a moment to inspect this corner of the material storage area. Whether or not the SWPPP calls this area out as a location where potential stormwater pollutants are stored, the CGP requires you to inspect all materials and equipment storage areas covered by the permit. At a minimum, you must walk fully around the area to check for evidence of improperly stored materials, leaks, staining, or other stormwater pollutant concerns. We are now standing.
Right, so we're pretty excited about that. We think it's because this is all online, having the ability to actually do basically abbreviated site visit will hopefully help people get a good sense of what things look like, what they're supposed to look like, what conditions to look for, that kind of thing. I mentioned the exam. To get basically a certificate of completion for the EPA exam, there's you would need to have 80% or higher score on the exam, which is 30 questions. It's basically questions that are pulled from a bank of ones we're developing. There's also some of these same questions will be used throughout in the different modules. They're called kind of knowledge questions, and they're basically testing people's understanding of the material. Once you've passed, and by the way, the person can take this multiple times if they don't pass the first time. But upon passing it, you would be able to print out a certificate that would be kept on site to show us that you are a qualified person. So that's for the EPA training program, but we understand there's a lot of really high quality programs out there, many of which you have been out there for years, and you may have already taken these and are ready to go, which is great. You can rely on those programs as long as they cover the minimum topics that I mentioned before, basically the principles and practices of erosion and sediment control and pollution prevention, and how to conduct a proper inspection and document your findings. We've identified some examples on our webpage of ones that we believe address the minimum topics. We'll be updating this list as we learn more about others. And just to emphasize that including any particular one on this list doesn't mean that we're endorsing and it's a course one over the other. It's just that they seem to have addressed the topics that we're interested in. Another requirement for for terminating coverage is to take pictures of the stabilized portions of your site. Basically, we want to understand that you have complied with these requirements. We view this as one of the most important aspects is how you stabilize the site before leaving. So make sure it's locked down to the extent possible for sediment. We'd like to see before and after photos. So photos taken before you've met the stabilization requirements and after. The photos need to be clear and in focus in the original format and resolution, include a date. You're going to be able to submit these electronically, by the way. So a lot of these things, there'll be prompts for you to include this information. And then a brief description of what we're looking at on the site. You don't need to take pictures of every distinct stabilized portion of the site. Some of these sites are quite large. I took a picture of this area. It's basically like a new kind of mixed commercial and residential area that's been around for years. And they stabilized it probably like 5 years ago because of financial issues. I don't think they were able to continue yet. But this is just a portion. The key issue is just make sure that the areas represented in the picture are substantially similar to those that aren't. No specialized equipment needed. Feel free to use a whatever digital camera you have on your phone, which is fine. And again, these are going to be set up with our electronic system, which can accommodate pretty large pictures. So those are the new requirements for the NOT. Lastly, and this is unique to the EPA CGP, those of you who work in one of the EPA states or tribal area, you'll know that that there's a section of the permit where some states, some tribes have additional requirements. This basically is implementing a section of the Clean Water Act called 401, Section 401 certification. And it's a process that enables the state and tribe to ensure that the EPA permit, which is available in its jurisdiction, is protective of its water quality. There are additional such requirements in this CGP in Part 9 of the permit. I'm not going to go over each name, but there's a bunch of states that have imposed requirements, as well as tribal areas within additional states. So if you're needing coverage under the EPA CGP, you will want to check out Part 9 because you may have additional requirements. I'm going to stop there and see if we have any additional questions.
Thank you. We do have some more questions. The first one that I would like to bring up is, Is use of a separate corrective action log required, or is it acceptable for corrective actions to be documented as part of a routine inspection report, as long as it contains all of the necessary information?
Yeah, if it has all the required information, you're good to go. Don't be tripped up, I think, by the fact that EPA has developed its own form that's an optional form. But if you have an inspection, if you have a way of documenting the findings of your inspection and all of the minimum things for the corrective action, you would have complied with the permit.
Thank you.
The question is, who will be required to do the discharge inspections? Is that intended to be the certified inspector or the contractor?
It could be one and the same person, but whoever that is, they have to be what the phrase is qualified individual, which they would have had to be completed the EPA course or have completed one of the non-EPA courses that meets all the content requirements.
Thank you. Maddie, do you happen to have the next question queued up?
I do. So it's, will the EPA training certificate have an expiration? How long will it be valid for? If using a non-EPA training course that does not have an expiration for the certification, will EPA require a refresher after the designated time or a designated time? For example, if after 2 or 3 years, will a refresher of the certification be needed if it does not expire?
The permit's basically silent on that, but our view would be that if you're taking the EPA course, it would be good for the remainder of the permit term. The plan is to update the training program as needed with future CGPs. So once the 2022 CGP expires, there should be an updated training, so you'd want to take the new one, and we'll clarify that. For the non-EPA trainings, some of them actually have built-in recertification requirements, in which case, like whatever applies to that specific training, if it doesn't have a expiration date, then that I suppose would be considered valid. They typically do, though, have requirements to refresh and update on a number of the programs we're familiar with. But anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Next question is, does being licensed professional engineer no longer qualify you to perform inspections?
Under our permit, you would need to ensure that you have met the training requirements. So licensed engineers isn't under our permit necessarily sufficient. If you've also taken one of these non-EPA courses already, that's fine. But you'd need to take one of the two options that's in the permit. That is after February 17, 2023. If you've got a project that's going on now, there isn't an EPA program, and so our requirements don't kick in until that date.
Thank you. Next question is, does EPA consider a property owner to meet the definition of an operator if the property owner does not have any participation or approval of the design, construction, or on-site activities? The property owner is just allowing the agency and/or contractor to access their property to complete work, for example.
It does sound like potentially the owner in that case might not be an operator. I'd want to know a little bit more. There's certainly owners that aren't operators. Look carefully at the examples that I provided to see whether you're outside of those, and also the language, the two different definitional requirements for operator, and make sure that the owner in this case doesn't have that operational control. It's certainly, by the question, it's certainly suggestive that they're not, but I can't really definitively say one way or the other with limited information.
Thank you. The next question is, if a property owner is different than the developer, does the property owner and developer need separate NOIs?
The answer would be yes, if they're, this is not going to satisfy anyone, but if they meet the definition of, Zach, you said owner and developer, is that right? Some of these terms
property
are
owner and developer, yes.
Property owner and developer. Some of these terms are like terms of art that might differ between states or areas, but in general, if you're exerting the type of operational control that we include in the definition, then both would have to be permitted. And that is not uncommon to have that be the case.
Thank you. Next question is, do we get a new NPDES permit number issued with 2022 coverage, or do projects retain their 2017 NPDES permit numbers?
It's a new permit number.
Thank you. Next question is, if we're covered under the 2017 permit or working on updating SWIP to then submit NOI, when would we start implementing 2022 requirements, such as dewatering turbidity requirements?
The simple answer is that you would start doing that once you get covered under the permit. So once you are notified that you're covered, you have your permit number, that's your day one, basically. Good actors, I'm not even good. If you're transitioning to the new permit, it certainly would be accepted and encouraged to transition into complying with those new requirements, but it's not expected that you do so. It's not required that you do so. We would, because you're not officially subject to the terms of that permit until we inform you that you are after you submit the NOI. I hope that covers it.
Thank you. Next question is, so for the inspection of dewatering, the inspector must be there from start to the end of the dewatering activities, or can they make a daily inspection that lasts for less than the time of dewatering? Say the dewatering activities are ongoing for the full day.
Yeah, I don't envision, I don't think we intended that the person have to be out there for the entire time of discharge. You need to have enough understanding of when the discharge started and ended, and to take kind of representative observations during the course of the day. So basically, at least one time, take the pictures that are required to document if there's any problematic concerns. And if there is a sediment plume, say, you'd want to initiate corrective action right then. But if there's not and everything looks a-okay, there's no need for the inspector to stay and just watch the discharge occurring. They just need to have enough information to know when it stopped that day so they can record that.
Thank you. Next question is, are sensitive waters only the first water, or could it be a further downstream, like the second, third, etc. water?
It's essentially the first water that the first waters of the United States that the discharge connects with. If that is a sensitive water, then you would be within the I guess the scope of the requirement you need to monitor. If it's not, and it's you know, several orders of you know, different connections downstream, then no.
Thank you. The next question is, can the turbidity benchmark for dewatering, 50 NTUs, be applied to runoff from the site?
Be applied to runoff from the site? You mean, I am interpreting that question as so this is extending the benchmark to stormwater discharges and not just dewatering discharges. And if that's what you intended, the answer is that our permit limits the benchmark to the dewatering discharge. You may want to check out the Part 9 state or tribal requirements, because there may be some additional benchmark requirements in there, but we don't extend it to the stormwater discharge. And I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question correctly, and feel free to contact us if you meant something else.
Thanks. Next question is, does each operator need to submit the quarterly report if they are both using the same data?
No, if you're on the same project site and one person's collecting the data and they're reporting it, there's a on both the paper and electronic forms, you could just basically, you would want to check in once per quarter at the right time and just indicate that someone else has submitted data on you as part of the same project. Yeah, and so you wouldn't both need to submit the same data, just one person would need to.
Thank you. Next question is, do dewatering activities trigger the 2022 CGP's new turbidity monitoring requirements if the discharge infiltrates on site or is subsequently captured by site stormwater retention basin?
Yeah, if there's no discharge from the site, from the dewatering operation, then there's, you know, there is no discharge from our permit perspective, and those requirements wouldn't apply. I'd be careful though. You mentioned, I think, a sediment basin, which would be designed to discharge. That would be a discharge. But if it's infiltrating, as you mentioned, there's no surface discharge at all. It's completely infiltrated. And by the way, if you're infiltrating, just make sure that you've checked out that there's no concern with an underground aquifer or other pollutant sources, as I mentioned before. But yeah, if there's no discharge, then the requirements wouldn't apply.
Thank you. Next question we have is, will there be an exemption for site stabilization photos as a requirement for a NOT in cases where the location is sensitive due to clearance/national security issues?
We didn't provide for an exception there. We do provide for an exception for some areas that basically are designed to be, that are allowed under the permit to remain kind of unstabilized. Those are very few, but I think that the assumption should be that there would be a way to capture the stabilized portion of the site without compromising security. But if that's a concern, I certainly think that's worth looking into, and feel free to get in touch with us about that.
Thanks. Next question is about NOT photos. Is the date and description displayed on the photo, or is a PDF compilation okay?
There is a field in the electronic submittal that allows you to enter the date. So you would enter the date of the photo there in the field when you're uploading your picture, even though it might appear on the photo itself. You're going to be directed to put the date in the electronic submittal form.
Thank you. Next question is, does EPA require the photo documentation or any electronic submitted report be kept along with the SWIP for 3 years after NOT?
Yes. That would be considered a record. So you should keep those for the 3 required years.
All right, the next question is, for projects in arid or semi-arid or drought-stricken areas, are before and after pictures applied to the initialization of final stabilization?
So you would do the before picture before you implemented stabilization measures, and then because in those drier areas, there's additional time given to achieve full vegetative stabilization, if that's what you're talking about. You would just the after photo would just be once you've installed the vegetative, you've done the plantings, you've done the non-vegetative erosion controls, whatever you're using. Take a picture of that. And in the description, you could indicate what we're looking at, what provide any other details that you want, but that would be compliance.
Thank you. Next question is, if adding dewatering after an NOI was processed, is a new NOI required?
No, you don't need to. So if you've already submitted an NOI and you answered, there was a question in the NOI about whether you're going to be dewatering. You said no, but there's a change. You're going to have to. You would modify the NOI to let us know, but you wouldn't need to resubmit an NOI.
Thanks. The next question is, have the criteria for endangered species been changed?
They really haven't been changed. What we did is the MSGP, our industrial stormwater permit, had adopted a smart form that basically takes the same eligibility criteria and takes you through a series of questions to help you arrive at the right one. And that's what we did for this. There's been a few minor language edits, but it's mostly really about the same eligibility criteria and making sure that you've included what was always required, but maybe not as clearly stated in the previous permit. So no significant changes to those.
Thank you. The next question is, SWIPs have to need all federal ESA requirements. Does that mean that consultations need the consultation letter, like from the IPAC?
Right. So I'm going to interpret that question. Your SWIP has to include any materials that you received from the services, or if you downloaded, let's say you were searching for species in your area using one of the online species search tools. IPAC is one of them. There is a requirement for some of the criteria to basically have the printout kept with your records, and you would keep it with your SWIP basically. There's a requirement in the SWIP to have all your ESA documents in one area. So I think the answer to your question is yes, you need to have that included in your SWIP.
Thank you. Let's see. Maddie, do you happen to have a question to read next?
Sure. So Greg, there's a few questions regarding updating the SWIP if you currently have 2017 CGP coverage. Do they need to develop a new SWIP, or is it acceptable to modify the SWIP, for example, reuse some of the content that hasn't had an updated requirement in the 2022 CGP?
Yeah, definitely reuse whatever you can from the previous SWIP. There's no need to like reinvent portions that haven't changed.
Based on the applicability flowchart, do projects in a combined sewer area require CGP coverage?
No, discharge to a combined system would not require coverage.
Another question is there still a link to track CGP projects?
Basically to search for currently permitted projects. I'm assuming that that's what you meant, and yes, there's still a search function under the net page where you can search for projects that are currently permitted.
Thank you. Next question is, if you have a 2017 MPDS NOI under review now, is a new NOI required?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because it sounds like you submitted it prior to February 17th and it's in process. I'm not sure if and you have it, and the 14 days hasn't expired, you may still receive coverage. I think you probably would. And then you'd still be subject to the new NOI requirements for the new permit by May 18th. You just fell victim to bad timing, is all I can say. And the reason is that you know, after a certain date, that permit is expired. It no longer is even a valid permit. So you need to get coverage under the valid permit, the 2022 one.
Thanks. Next question we have is, do we have to go back and complete additional coordination from USFWS and NMFS for projects covered under the 2017 CGP for projects extending past May 2022?
And presumably the project already went through some kind of process with them to get eligibility. I would say that you would still be able to rely on the previous eligibility, and you'd keep the same documents. It's pretty clear what documents you have to have. They're basically the same as previous, so you'd want to make sure that you've backed all that up in case anyone needs to look at it.
Thank you. Next question is, if the owner and operator are different and submit an NOI, can they share the SWIP?
Yes. There's language in the permit that that speaks directly to that. You can have the same SWIP. There's some language about responsibility, but you can divvy up responsibilities within the SWIP, however, whatever makes sense to you. Bottom line, though, if you're holding a permit, you're still ultimately responsible if there's non-compliance. But barring that, it's perfectly acceptable to have a common SWIP.
Thank you. Next question is, will US EPA make all the information on NOIs, NOTs, etc. readily available online to the public? For example, using Echo?
Zach, can you repeat the first part? Is just NOIs they're talking about?
NOIs, NOTs, etc.
Yes. Yeah, that's all available and can be searched on the public side of the web. So you can search for all of that.
Zach, I'm going to jump in with an overall question regarding the list of third-party inspector certifications. If there's a specific certification that is not included, how would what information should someone present to get that inspector certification included in the list, and who should they contact to discuss that?
There's a permit requirement for that. In the inspection section, you'll see that basically, if you're not on that list, that's fine. You would need to have in your records the certificate of completion, whatever that was, whatever applies, and a short description of why you feel like the specific course met the basic course requirements. And those course requirements are listed in the permit. And I went over that briefly in the presentation, but basically, yeah, that wouldn't be a problem. And that list is not an exhaustive list. We did the best we could with looking at the courses that were available to us. But if you have any questions about that, let us know.
Thank you. Maddie, do you have another question queued up?
Sure. I think you've already addressed this, Greg, but this question has come through a few times. For operators that currently have 2017 CGP coverage, when do the turbidity benchmark monitoring requirements start? Is that when the new NOI, once they get coverage under the 2022 CGP, or as soon as the 2022 CGP is effective?
The requirements for turbidity wouldn't apply to you until you have coverage under the new permit. So whenever that is for you, that's when you would need to start complying with those requirements.
Okay, great. And then for the photo, the pre-stabilization photo, is that required to be submitted with the NOI or with the NOT?
With the NOT.
All right, there's still many, many more questions. Is there someone these questions can be directed to, or a way that these questions can be answered outside of this webinar?
Yeah, this is the email that you can use for any questions we didn't get to. And we can try also to reach out to you with questions we didn't get to. But if you want to make sure we receive them, email this is a dedicated email address for things like this. So fire away and we'll get back to you. Thanks everyone for participating, and the questions were really great. You know, keep them coming outside of the webinar. We hope this was useful to you, and yeah, thank you.